All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at the 2013 film 47 Ronin.
Starring Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, starring Keanu Reeves.
A lot of opinions on this one.
We got a whole stack of IMDb reviews here, and yeah, people had a lot to say.
Some loved it.
Some hated it.
Visual masterpiece.
Historical inaccuracy.
All over the place.
Yeah, really all over the place. It's going to be interesting to unpack it all.
It really is.
Now, this film is a reimagining of a classic Japanese tale. And it's interesting how this one's kind of become a lightning rod.
Definitely.
Yeah.
A clash of expectations, I think.
Yeah.
You know, you've got folks looking for a really faithful, true adaptation.
Right, right.
And then you've got those who are just ready for like the Hollywood spectacle.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do you bridge that gap?
Right. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with the story, 47 Ronin is based on the true story of 47 samurai who avenged their master's death.
Classic tale.
Classic tale.
Really well known in Japan.
But this film throws in some extra elements, which is mythical beasts and
King Keanu Reeves.
Keanu Reeves.
As Kai.
A half-British, half-Japanese outcast.
Yeah. Already we're seeing some folks raise an eyebrow.
Right away. I mean, right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this historical context for a minute, because, 17th century Japan was under Sakoku.
Very strict isolationist policy.
Strict isolationist policy.
So a character like Kai, even though it gives Keanu Reeves a central role, it kind of clashes with that historical reality, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And some reviewers, I think, really feel like right out of the gate, this sets the tone for a film that might be prioritizing the spectacle over that authenticity.
Yeah, okay, so we're already seeing this tension between the historical accuracy and the artistic license that the film is taking. But before we go too far down that road, let's give our listeners a taste of the plot.
All right.
So, basic plot. We've got a band of samurai on a revenge mission, forbidden romance, epic sword fights. The works.
Yeah, the works.
So does it all come together?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Because even reviewers who were pretty harsh about these historical liberties that the film took, a lot of them still acknowledged the film's visual strengths.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the costumes, the sets, the action sequences. A lot of people call them breathtaking.
I've heard that.
Yeah. And there's a pretty consistent praise for Hiroyuki Sanada, who plays Oishi, the leader of the Ronin.
I've heard great things about his performance. Some reviewers have even said that his gravitas is like the saving grace for the film.
It seems that way.
Or the performance is so good that it kind of elevates the whole thing.
Yeah, it almost seems like some reviewers are contrasting that grounded performance that Sanada's given as Oishi with Keanu Reeves' performance, which is more stoic, more, some would argue less emotionally expressive as Kai.
Right, right.
So then we come up to this, what I'm calling the Keanu Reeves factor.
The Keanu Reeves factor. Okay, so help me understand this. Was he simply miscast? Or is there something more at play here?
Well, I think it's kind of complex because Reeves' acting style, right?
Yeah.
Often associated with like Western action heroes, kind of clashes with that really nuanced emotional expression that people often expect from, samurai characters in Japanese cinema.
Yeah, yeah.
And so some reviewers felt like his presence, even though it was meant to draw in a wider audience, maybe even ironically alienated the folks who were looking for that more culturally sensitive portrayal.
Okay, so we've got this tension between like commercial appeal and artistic integrity, right?
Right.
It's almost like they're trying to make a film for two different audiences and maybe not fully satisfying either.
It's a tough line to walk.
Yeah, it is. And speaking of things not being fully satisfying, let's talk about the romance.
Okay.
Between Kai and Mika, the fallen lord's daughter.
The reviews on this were really interesting because while a lot of people called it cliché underdeveloped, a lot of the focus was on Mika's lack of agency.
Okay.
Like she kind of fades into the background. Her story becomes almost secondary to the men's pursuit of revenge.
Right.
And one reviewer even said that she just kind of lacks agency and disappears.
This seems to be echoing like a broader criticism that we're seeing in the reviews, right?
Yeah.
That the film tries to do too much, and in doing so, it sacrifices some depth.
For the spectacle?
For the spectacle, yeah.
Yeah, that's a consistent complaint for sure.
Okay, so we've got historical inaccuracies. We've got, potentially underwhelming romance.
Right.
And then we've got this whole debate about the fantasy elements.
Because some viewers loved them.
Yeah.
Especially those who were already familiar with Japanese folklore.
Right.
They enjoyed those creatures.
Yeah.
The sorcery.
Sure.
They thought it added to that visual appeal and the kind of mythical atmosphere.
But then you have others who are saying it's disrespectful to the source material, turning this revered historical tale into like a generic fantasy flick.
Right.
So we're back to that question of, authenticity versus artistic license.
It's a classic debate.
It really is.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. And this is where I think the whole concept of exoticism comes in, right?
Okay.
When elements of another culture are used for their aesthetic appeal, but without a deeper understanding or respect for their meaning.
Right, like they're just using Japanese folklore as window dressing rather than actually, genuinely exploring its significance.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got historical inaccuracies, we've got potentially underwhelming romance, and then we have this debate about the fantasy elements.
Yeah.
Is there anything this film gets right?
Well, beyond the visuals, and we've talked about those,
Right.
I think the most divisive element, and maybe the key to understand all these different reactions, is Keanu Reeves' character.
Okay, so the Keanu Reeves factor.
Exactly.
Let's dig into that.
Yeah.
'Cause we've got, people praising him,
Right.
people wishing he wasn't in the film.
Totally.
What is the heart of this divide?
That's what we need to unpack.
So it seems like the Keanu Reeves factor, people see what they want to see.
It's like a Rorschach test.
It really is.
Some see his, that familiar stoicism as a good fit for this kind of brooding warrior.
Mm-hmm.
But others just feel like it clashes with, the cultural context of the story.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like, what were the filmmakers going for?
Right.
Were they trying to use his star power to introduce a wider audience to Japanese culture?
Right.
Or did they just prioritize commercial appeal over cultural sensitivity?
Right, right.
And the reviews don't really offer a clear answer,
Yeah.
but it really highlights this inherent tension
Yeah.
in adapting stories from other cultures for a global audience.
It's a tough thing to get right.
It really is.
And speaking of things that are tough to get right, let's talk about the runtime of the film, because it clocks in at just under 2 hours.
Yeah, it's not very long for a film like this.
And some reviewers felt like it was just too short.
Too short, especially when it came to character development.
Like who?
The villain, Lord Kira, and Mizuki, the shape-shifting witch.
Okay.
They're interesting figures. They got complex motivations.
Mm-hmm.
But the film doesn't really give them a lot of space.
Right, right.
One reviewer said, give it another 20 or 30 minutes and you could really explore those characters more.
Yeah, flesh them out a little bit.
Yeah.
This makes me think about, the pacing of the film.
Okay.
Do you think they focus so much on the action
Right.
and the spectacle that they kind of sacrifice some of that character development?
Right. Those quieter moments
Yeah.
that let you really explore the characters.
Yeah, did they just have to keep the story moving too fast to let that happen?
Yeah, I think that's a valid question.
Yeah.
And it kind of raises a broader point about storytelling choices, right?
Right.
Do you go for that visual spectacle and that fast-paced plot?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you allow those moments of introspection
Right.
and deeper character exploration?
Right, yeah. And it seems like in this case,
They went for the former,
they went for the former.
which maybe explains why some viewers found it lacking that emotional depth.
Yeah, and this brings us back to the Keanu Reeves factor.
Okay.
Because one reviewer explicitly said that this film might have actually been better received
Wow.
if he hadn't been in it at all.
That's a bold statement.
It is a bold statement.
Yeah.
But it does make you think, would it have resonated more if it was just the Japanese actors?
Right. Focusing on those characters.
Yeah. Would it have been seen as more authentic, more culturally sensitive?
If they hadn't tried to shoehorn in this, Western action star
Yeah.
into this story that's so deeply rooted in Japanese culture.
It is fascinating to think about how a cast and choice can really have such a ripple effect
Oh, absolutely.
on so many aspects of the film.
Yeah, not just the commercial appeal,
Right.
but also, the artistic merit, the cultural impact, all of it.
It's like that one choice really changes things.
It really does.
So let's go back to the fantasy elements for a minute.
Okay.
Because we've talked about how some folks felt they were disrespectful, but there were folks who liked them.
Right.
What did they see in these fantasy elements?
Well, a lot of the reviewers who already had a background in Japanese folklore,
Yeah.
they really appreciated seeing those elements brought to life.
Okay, so it was more for them
Yeah.
than for people who are unfamiliar.
It seems like it.
Okay.
They liked seeing those creatures like the Kirin,
Yeah.
the mythical beast that symbolizes prosperity, and the Tengu,
Yeah.
those demon-like, bird-like creatures.
Right.
And they felt like it added, a layer of depth and richness to the story.
So for them, it worked.
Yeah, for viewers who have that connection already to those myths and legends, seeing it on screen
Yeah.
can be really powerful.
Yeah, okay, but for others, it felt like kind of a mishmash of stereotypes.
Right, like a very superficial attempt
Uh-huh.
to just kind of add that exotic flair without really understanding the meaning behind it.
Right.
And that brings us back to that danger of exoticism, right?
Right.
It's not just about including those elements, it's about doing it respectfully and authentically.
Understanding the context.
That's right, the symbolism, the deeper meaning.
And it seems like that's where the film maybe stumbles for some.
It's like it's caught between these two worlds, right?
It is. Yeah.
It wants to be both this visually stunning Hollywood spectacle
Yeah.
and this faithful adaptation of this revered Japanese tale.
Yeah.
And it's not quite doing either.
Yeah.
And I think that's at the heart of this whole divisive reception.
It really is. It's like, trying to do too much and ending up
Not quite sticking the landing.
not sticking the landing. Yeah. So we've gone through all these elements, the historical inaccuracies, the romance, the fantasy creatures, the Keanu Reeves factor.
Yeah.
What is the final verdict?
Oh, I don't know if I can give a final verdict.
Fair enough.
The beauty of art is that it's subjective.
Right.
What one person finds captivating, another might find boring.
Sure.
And I think 47 Ronin is a perfect example of that.
It
really evokes strong reactions from people.
both positive and negative.
Yeah, both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, it's a film that sparks conversation, it challenges perceptions, and I think ultimately it leaves viewers with these, bigger questions.
About culture.
About culture, about representation, about storytelling.
And in a way, that might be its greatest achievement.
That's a good point.
Even though it's not universally loved,
Yeah.
It's got people talking.
It does. And that's a good reminder that even a film that's, maybe not perfect
Right.
can still have an impact
A big impact.
on how we see the world.
And the stories that we tell.
So even with all its flaws, all the controversies, 47 Ronin has given us a lot to think about.
It really has.
But before we wrap up this deep dive completely,
But-
I kind of want to shift gears just a little bit
Right.
and talk about one element that's kind of woven throughout the whole story.
Okay.
Bushido.
The samurai code of honor.
Yeah, and this is a concept that, is often romanticized in pop culture,
It is.
but it has a really complex and nuanced history.
It does.
So for folks who might not be familiar, can you kind of give us a quick rundown of Bushido?
So Bushido, it emphasizes things like loyalty, honor, courage, self-discipline,
Mm-hmm.
and a willingness to sacrifice yourself for a righteous cause.
So how does the film portray Bushido?
Well, that's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
It definitely showcases the key elements, that unwavering loyalty,
Mm-hmm.
the willingness to sacrifice everything for revenge, that adherence to the code of conduct.
Right.
But it also kind of grapples with the complexities of Bushido,
Okay.
particularly that conflict between duty and personal desires.
Right.
So, for example, you see Oishi, the leader of the Ronin, he's really struggling
Yeah.
with the decision to go on this mission,
When they're going to die.
knowing that it'll probably end in their deaths, right?
Right.
And you see Kai, the outsider, kind of question the rigidity of that samurai code.
Right. Offering a different perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's suggesting that Bushido's not just about blind obedience. It's about making those difficult choices
Right.
and navigating those complexities.
Yeah. So it's not just black and white.
No, not at all.
It's really about navigating this gray area.
Absolutely.
That's so interesting how the film uses this historical code to kind of explore themes that are still relevant today.
Oh, definitely.
Like, what does it mean to be loyal?
Right.
How far are we willing to go to uphold our principles?
What sacrifices are we willing to make
What sacrifices, yeah.
for a greater cause?
Yeah, it makes you think.
It really does.
And I think that's the beauty of these historical stories,
Yeah.
They offer us this lens to kind of look back
Mm.
at our own values, our own beliefs.
In our choices,
Yeah.
it makes you challenge how you think about the past
Right.
and how it informs the present.
So 47 Ronin might not be a perfect film,
No,
but it's certainly a thought-provoking pig.
for sure.
It sparks conversation.
Absolutely.
It challenges assumptions.
It does.
And it really does invite you to kind of think more deeply about this chapter of Japanese history.
And Japanese culture.
Yeah,
It's a rich story.
it is. And it reminds us of the power of storytelling, right?
Oh, yeah,
To
absolutely.
connect us across cultures, across generations.
It's a powerful thing.
It really is.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think it's time to move into the final act of our deep dive.
Okay.
We've explored the film's strengths and weaknesses. We've debated the historical accuracies, the cultural sensitivity. We even talked about Bushido.
Right.
But there's one final question I want to leave our listener with.
I'm intrigued. What is it?
We've talked a lot about how 47 Ronin tries to adapt, a real historical event,
Right.
but it also adds in those, like, fantastical elements.
Yeah, the witches and the demons and thing.
Exactly. So if you were the filmmaker, how would you approach this?
Mm.
Would you stick to the historical facts, or would you embrace the fantasy?
That's a great question.
Right.
I think I'd lean more towards that political intrigue that led to the master's downfall.
Interesting. So really focus in on that.
Yeah,
Cool.
more so than the individual journeys of the Ronin.
Okay, interesting. What about Bushido?
Yes.
How would you portray that? As a strict set of rules or more of a complex philosophy?
I think it's got to be complex, right?
Yeah, it's not black and white.
It's not black and white. It's that gray area that makes it so interesting.
Right. And think about how you'd portray, like, the Ronin's grief.
Oh, yeah.
Their determination for revenge.
Their commitment.
Yeah, because the historical account is really tragic.
Incredibly tragic.
They commit ritual suicide after they get their revenge.
Right. Would you stay true to that?
That's a tough question.
Or would you imagine a different path?
Right. Do you really lean into that tragedy?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or give it a glimmer of hope?
So many choices.
So many choices as a filmmaker, yeah. And thinking back to the Keanu Reeves factor,
Right.
would you cast a Western actor?
To try to bring in that audience.
Right, yeah.
That's a tough one.
It's a tough decision.
Do you go for authenticity?
Right.
Or do you go for that broad appeal?
It's like this balancing act
It really is.
between those two things.
But I think what's interesting is even the reviewers who really didn't like the film, they still engaged with those questions.
Right. It's almost like the flaws kind of made it more interesting.
They sparked a debate.
Exactly.
And that's what's so fascinating. Sometimes a film's flaws can be as insightful as its strengths.
Right.
You know?
They force you to think more critically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
47 Ronin, even with that mixed reception, it gave us more to talk about than, a film that everyone just loved.
I agree. This deep dive has been a whirlwind.
It really has.
Visual spectacle, cultural representation, Bushido, alternate endings. We talked about it all.
We did.
What stands out to you as, like, the most important takeaway?
I think it's just how this one film got such a range of reactions,
Mm-hmm.
It just reminds us that art is subjective.
It is.
Interpretations vary. And even a flawed film can get people talking.
Absolutely.
And 47 Ronin, I think it acts as this lens for examining our own values,
Yeah.
about history, culture, storytelling.
It makes you think.
It does.
And it highlights something really important about what we do here in these deep dives.
Yeah.
It's not just about summarizing opinions. It's about understanding why people feel the way they do,
Exactly.
engaging with the material on that deeper level.
Absolutely.
And so for anyone listening, if this has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to go explore the story of the 47 Ronin yourself.
Yeah. Check out some other adaptations.
Yeah, read the historical accounts. Maybe even come up with your own interpretation.
Get creative.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
A wealth of information.
And maybe you'll even be inspired to create your own version of this tale.
That's what we love to see.
So we've reached the end of our journey into 47 Ronin. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.